abandoned his crippled wife at the hospital to marry his secretary. But what he didn't know was that the woman he left broken and helpless in that sterile room was actually a secret multi-billionaire who had been faking her injury for months to test his loyalty. The wheelchair she sat in during their final conversation was nothing but a prop in an elaborate performance, but the tears streaming down her face as he walked away with his mistress were devastatingly real. His secretary, now his bride-to-be, sneered at the pathetic scene, but she had no idea that the woman she was replacing controlled the very company where she had spent years fetching coffee and filing papers. When she stood up at the gala 6 months later, her transformation from broken victim to powerful business magnate would shatter everything he thought he knew about power, loyalty, and the catastrophic price of betrayal. His world collapsed in that single moment, but the destruction had been carefully orchestrated from the day he first looked at his secretary with desire in his eyes. The crippled wife he abandoned wasn't crippled at all, but the man who left her would soon discover that some wheelchairs are thrones in disguise, and some women are forces of nature waiting for the perfect moment to unleash a storm that would leave nothing but ruins in its wake. Had he ever truly known the woman he married, or had he been so blinded by ambition and lust that he failed to see the empire hidden behind her vulnerable facade? Would his secretary still have seduced him if she'd known that the woman in the wheelchair controlled more wealth than he could accumulate in 10 lifetimes? Could any amount of regret undo the moment he chose temporary passion over permanent partnership with a woman who had been testing whether his love was as real as the fortune she'd hidden from him? The fluorescent lights of Mercy General Hospital hummed with mechanical indifference as Victoria Montgomery watched her husband of 8 years pack her belongings into a single duffel bag, but his hands moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had already emotionally checked out months ago. The wheelchair she sat in creaked slightly as she shifted her weight, maintaining the illusion of paralysis that had become second nature over the past 6 months, but her mind raced with crystalline clarity as she observed every micro-expression that crossed Daniel Thorne's face. His jaw was set with that particular tightness she'd first noticed 3 months into her condition, but back then she'd foolishly attributed it to concern rather than recognizing it for what it truly was: resentment. "I've arranged for a private care facility," Daniel said, his voice carrying none of the warmth that had once made her heart flutter during their wedding vows, but instead resonating with the hollow efficiency of a businessman closing a deal he no longer found profitable. His steel-gray eyes, the same eyes that had promised her forever beneath a canopy of cherry blossoms, now refused to meet her gaze directly, but she could see the guilt warring with determination in the set of his shoulders. "They specialize in long-term rehabilitation for spinal injuries, and the insurance will cover most of it." Victoria's fingers tightened imperceptibly on the armrests of her wheelchair, but she maintained the slight tremor in her hands that had become part of her performance. "When will you visit?" she asked, her voice carefully modulated to sound weak and hopeful. But internally she was already calculating how many seconds it would take for him to deliver the blow she'd been expecting for weeks. "Victoria," Daniel began, but the pause that followed stretched like taffy, becoming so thin and fragile that she could practically see through it to the ugly truth beneath. He ran his hand through his dark hair, a tell she'd learned to recognize during their courtship when he was nervous about something. But this time the gesture carried finality rather than endearing vulnerability. "I need to be honest with you." The door to her hospital room opened before he could continue, but Victoria had already seen the future in his eyes, and what walked through that door was simply the confirmation of betrayals she'd suspected since the day she'd decided to fake her injury. Amber Sutton entered with the kind of confidence that comes from youth and ignorance, her designer heels clicking against the linoleum with staccato authority, but her eyes betrayed a predatory satisfaction that made Victoria's carefully maintained facade almost crack with rage. Amber had been Daniel's secretary for 3 years, but Victoria had noticed the subtle shift in their dynamic approximately 14 months ago. The way Amber's hand would linger a second too long when passing Daniel files. The way her laughter at his mediocre jokes had become increasingly performative. The way her skirts had grown progressively shorter during board meetings. Victoria had said nothing then, but she'd initiated a test that would reveal the true nature of the man she'd married. A test that required her to become something she wasn't, helpless. "Daniel, the car is waiting," Amber said, her voice dripping with faux sympathy that barely concealed her triumph, but her eyes locked onto Victoria with undisguised contempt. She walked to Daniel's side with proprietary confidence, her hand sliding up his arm in a gesture so intimate that it answered every question Victoria had deliberately left unasked. "We don't want to miss our flight." Victoria felt something hot and sharp twist in her chest, but she channeled it into making her hands shake more visibly, into letting tears, real ones born from the death of hope rather than the death of love, pool in her eyes. "Flight?" she whispered, but she already had known for weeks, if she was being honest with herself, that this moment would come precisely this way. Daniel's face flushed with something that might have been shame in another man, but in him manifested as defensive anger at being caught in a situation of his own making. "Amber and we're getting married," he said, the words tumbling out with the graceless haste of someone ripping off a bandage, but his eyes finally met hers, and what she saw there was worse than hatred. It was relief. "I can't do this anymore, Victoria, and I can't sacrifice my happiness indefinitely for someone who will never walk again." The irony of his statement nearly made Victoria laugh, but she swallowed the sound and let it transform into a sob that shook her shoulders convincingly. She'd been practicing her reactions in mirrors, perfecting the art of appearing broken while her mind remained sharp as surgical steel, but nothing had quite prepared her for the visceral reality of hearing her marriage dissolve into casual cruelty. "You're leaving me?" Victoria's voice cracked authentically, but internally she was cataloging every detail of this betrayal for the accounting that would come. "Now? When I need you most?" Amber's lips curled into something too vicious to be called a smile, but she stepped forward with theatrical boldness that betrayed her working-class insecurity beneath designer labels. She pulled a tissue from her Prada handbag, purchased Victoria knew with the bonus Daniel had given her last Christmas. But instead of offering it with compassion, she dangled it like a taunt. "Oh, sweetheart," Amber cooed with poisonous sweetness, but her eyes glittered with malice. "Did you really think a man like Daniel would waste his prime years playing nursemaid to a cripple?" The slap of the word hung in the air like gun smoke, but Victoria schooled her features into devastated acceptance rather than the cold fury that threatened to break through her mask. Amber moved closer, emboldened by Victoria's apparent helplessness, but she had no idea she was circling a sleeping tiger that had chosen to feign weakness for reasons beyond her comprehension. "Look at you," Amber continued, her voice rising with the confidence of someone who believed herself utterly victorious, but her hand reached out to grip Victoria's chin with calculated cruelty. "Sitting there in your sad little wheelchair with your sad little life, thinking you could keep a man like Daniel satisfied with pity and obligation." She leaned down until their faces were inches apart, her breath hot with coffee and triumph. But her next action would become the centerpiece of Victoria's vengeance. "You were never enough for him, but I am." Then Amber did something that transcended mere verbal cruelty into physical assault. She gathered saliva in her mouth and spat directly into Victoria's face, but the glob landed on Victoria's cheek with such force that it ran down her jaw in a humiliating trail. "That's what I think of pathetic cripples who try to trap men with guilt," Amber hissed, but she'd just sealed her fate in ways her limited imagination couldn't begin to fathom. Daniel's eyes widened with shock that suggested even he hadn't expected this level of viciousness. But he didn't step forward to defend his wife, didn't hand her a tissue, didn't tell Amber that she'd crossed a line from which there was no return. Instead, he looked away, his silence serving as tacit approval of the degradation, but that single moment of cowardice would cost him more than he could possibly calculate. Victoria sat there, spit running down her face, her hands trembling in her lap, tears streaming from her eyes, but behind her devastated expression, something cold and mathematical was taking shape. She'd orchestrated this test to see if Daniel's love was real, if he would stand by her through genuine hardship. But the experiment had revealed something far more valuable: the exact depth of his worthlessness and the precise measure of Amber's cruelty. "I'll have my lawyers send the divorce papers to the facility," Daniel said, his voice tight with discomfort but resolute with selfish determination. But he was already moving toward the door with Amber attached to his arm like a parasite. "I'll make sure you're taken care of financially, within reason." "Within reason," Victoria repeated hollowly, letting the word sound like a death knell to her ears, but internally calculating the exquisite irony of that phrase. Daniel Thorne, junior partner at Whitmore and Associates, pulling in $340,000 annually, promising to take care within reason of the woman who secretly controlled a business empire valued at $8.7 billion. The mathematics of it were almost funny, but Victoria had learned long ago that revenge was a dish best served with compound interest. "We really must go," Amber said, tugging Daniel toward the door with eager impatience, but she paused to deliver one final twist of the knife. She walked back to Victoria's wheelchair, pulled out her phone with manicured nails that Victoria's wealth had indirectly funded through Daniel's salary, but she angled it to capture Victoria's devastated, spit-stained face in cruel clarity. "I want to remember this moment," Amber said, snapping several photos while Victoria sat frozen in apparent, helpless humiliation. But she didn't know she was documenting evidence that would later destroy her. "The moment I won." They left then, Daniel pulling the door closed with a finality that echoed through the sterile hospital room. But Victoria sat unmoving in her wheelchair for a full 3 minutes after their footsteps faded down the corridor. Only when she was absolutely certain they were gone did she allow her trembling hands to steady, her slumped shoulders to straighten, but she remained seated as she pulled her phone from where it had been hidden beneath the blanket on her lap. "Did you get everything?" Victoria asked, her voice suddenly clear and commanding, stripped of the fragile weakness she'd been performing for months. "Every word, every gesture, every contemptible second," replied Marcus Chen, her head of security and the man who'd been monitoring the room from 4 different hidden cameras, but his voice carried satisfaction mixed with barely controlled rage. "Ms. Montgomery, if I may speak freely, you want to destroy them immediately," Victoria finished, but her lips curved into something that resembled a smile, the way a shark's mouth resembles a friendly grin. "Patience, Marcus, and remember the plan has always been to let them think they've won, right up until the moment we teach them what real power looks like." She disconnected the call and allowed herself one moment of genuine emotion. She wiped the spit from her face with shaking hands, but the tears that fell now were hot with fury rather than sorrow. She hadn't cried when her parents died in the plane crash that left her a billionaire orphan at 19, but something about the casual cruelty of the past hour had pierced through armor she'd spent years constructing. The backstory of how Victoria Montgomery became a secret billionaire was one she'd carefully hidden from everyone, including the man she'd foolishly married, but it traced back to the pharmaceutical empire her grandfather had built, from a single patent into a global juggernaut. Montgomery Pharmaceuticals had been deliberately restructured into a web of holding companies and shell corporations after her parents' death, but the entire labyrinth ultimately flowed upward to Victoria's absolute control. She'd met Daniel at a charity gala where she'd been posing as a mid-level event coordinator, but her disguise had been deliberate. She'd wanted to find a man who would love her for herself rather than her fortune. What a catastrophically naive hope that had been. But the test she'd designed had at least revealed the truth before she'd wasted decades on a man who viewed marriage as a transaction rather than a partnership. 6 months ago, she'd accidentally fallen down the stairs of their penthouse, but the fall had been carefully choreographed with the help of Marcus and her private physician. The spinal injury had been a complete fabrication, supported by doctored medical records and paid actors playing concerned specialists. But Daniel had never questioned the diagnosis because he'd been too busy texting Amber to actually investigate his wife's condition. Victoria had watched from her wheelchair as Daniel's concern morphed into resentment over the course of weeks, but she'd said nothing as he spent longer hours at the office, took more business trips that coincided with Amber's own absences, came home smelling of unfamiliar perfume. She'd documented everything while playing the role of the oblivious, dependent wife. But her private investigators had compiled a dossier that would make a prosecuting attorney weep with joy. Now, as she sat alone in the hospital room with spit still drying on her face, Victoria made a decision that would reverberate through the social and business circles of Manhattan for years to come. But she would need the perfect stage for the revelation she was planning. The annual Whitmore and Associates Gala was scheduled for 6 months from today, but she'd already ensured through careful manipulation that Daniel would receive an invitation that included a +1 for his new wife. Victoria stood up from the wheelchair with fluid grace, her legs steady and strong because they'd never been injured in the first place, but she allowed herself a moment to stretch muscles that had grown stiff from months of feigned paralysis. She walked to the window of her hospital room, looking out over the Manhattan skyline that represented a kingdom she secretly ruled, but she was already planning every move of the chess game that would end with Daniel and Amber's complete destruction. 6 months later, the Metropolitan Ballroom of the Carlyle Hotel glittered with old money and new ambition as Victoria Montgomery prepared to make her entrance at the annual Whitmore and Associates Gala. But her reflection in the full-length mirror showed a woman transformed from the broken victim Daniel had abandoned. Her gown was custom Valentino, midnight blue silk that caught the light like liquid sapphire. But more importantly, it announced wealth and power that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. Her auburn hair, which she'd kept simply styled during her marriage, now cascaded in waves that had been shaped by Manhattan's most expensive stylist, but her green eyes held the cold fire of a woman who'd spent 6 months planning a very specific kind of revenge. "The car is ready, Ms. Montgomery," Marcus said from the doorway of her penthouse suite, but his formal address was for the benefit of the staff rather than habit. Mr. Thorne and his new wife arrived approximately 20 minutes ago. Victoria's lips curved into a smile that held no warmth whatsoever, but she picked up the diamond clutch that cost more than Daniel's annual salary and moved toward the door with predatory grace. "Then I believe we're fashionably late enough to make an impression, but early enough to maximize their discomfort." The 6 months since Daniel had abandoned her at the hospital had been productive in ways he couldn't begin to imagine. But Victoria had used every day to position her pieces for this exact moment. Through a series of carefully orchestrated corporate maneuvers, she'd ensured that Montgomery Pharmaceuticals still hidden behind its corporate veil, had acquired a controlling interest in Whitmore and Associates, but the partners wouldn't learn about their new ownership structure until tomorrow morning. Daniel's position as junior partner was about to become significantly less secure, but he had no idea that the crippled wife he'd discarded actually controlled his professional fate. The elevator descended 43 floors, but Victoria used the time to center herself, to ensure that her performance tonight would be flawless. She'd spent weeks working with a team that included a psychologist specializing in manipulation, a former intelligence officer who'd taught her micro-expressions and behavioral analysis, but most importantly, she'd spent hours in front of mirrors, learning to weaponize her own presence. The Carlyle's lobby was a study in marble and gold, but Victoria walked through it with the kind of confidence that made people turn and stare even before they recognized who she might be. The gala was being held in the grand ballroom on the second floor, but she took her time ascending the curved staircase, allowing whispers to build in her wake like a rising tide of speculation. She paused at the entrance to the ballroom, but the doors were open, and she could see directly to where Daniel stood near the bar, his arm wrapped possessively around Amber's waist. He'd gained weight over the past 6 months, the softness of a man who'd achieved his goal and grown complacent. But Amber had undergone her own transformation into the kind of trophy wife that men like Daniel believed elevated their status. Her blonde hair had been extended and highlighted, her breasts surgically enhanced, her designer gown cut to maximize attention, but she wore wealth the way someone wears a costume they haven't quite figured out yet. Victoria watched them for a moment, but she was cataloging the guest list with the efficiency of a general surveying a battlefield. She spotted Jerome Whitmore, the senior partner whose firm now unknowingly belonged to her, holding court near the stage, but his wife Claire stood apart from him, her eyes sharp with the intelligence of a woman who'd built half her husband's success from behind the scenes. Victoria had already scheduled a breakfast meeting with Claire for next week, but tonight was about theater rather than business. She stepped into the ballroom, but she didn't rush toward Daniel. Instead, she moved through the crowd like royalty, making a progression, stopping to exchange pleasantries with people who had no idea they were addressing the billionaire who controlled significant portions of their professional lives. She'd spent the past 6 months carefully revealing her true identity to select individuals, but always under strict non-disclosure agreements that would bankrupt anyone who violated them. It took 7 minutes for Daniel to notice her, but Victoria timed it perfectly. She was laughing at something Jerome Whitmore had said when Daniel's eyes locked onto her across the room, and she watched his face drain of color with savage satisfaction. His hand tightened convulsively on his champagne glass, but his eyes were glued to the impossible sight of his supposedly paralyzed ex-wife standing on steady legs and commanding the attention of the room's most powerful players. Amber noticed Daniel's reaction before she saw Victoria, but when she followed his gaze, her own face transformed into a mask of confused outrage that would have been comical under different circumstances. She grabbed Daniel's arm with talons disguised as manicured nails, but her mouth was moving in urgent whispers that Victoria was too far away to hear but could easily imagine. Victoria excused herself from Jerome and began walking directly toward Daniel and Amber, but she maintained a leisurely pace that forced them to watch her approach with mounting dread. Every step she took was a contradiction of the helpless woman Daniel had abandoned. But more than that, every eye in the ballroom was following her progress with curiosity that would soon transform into shock. "Daniel," Victoria said when she finally reached him, her voice carrying the polished confidence of someone who'd spent 6 months preparing for this exact confrontation. But she didn't extend her hand for a greeting. "I hope you've been well?" Daniel's mouth opened and closed like a suffocating fish, but no words emerged because his brain was too busy trying to reconcile the woman before him with the woman he'd left broken in a hospital wheelchair. His eyes traveled from her steady legs up to her face, searching for an explanation that would make sense of the impossible. But Victoria offered him nothing except a smile that promised consequences he couldn't yet fathom. "You—" Amber started, but her voice came out as a strangled whisper that betrayed her shock. She stepped forward aggressively, her instinct to attack overwhelming her confusion, but Victoria held up a single finger that stopped her as effectively as a physical barrier. "You were crippled, and you can walk." "Oh, I could always walk," Victoria said conversationally, but her words were loud enough to carry to the people nearest them, and she watched awareness ripple outward through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water. "I was never actually injured, Amber, but I needed to test whether my husband's love was real or merely convenience." She turned her attention fully to Daniel, but her green eyes held the kind of cold fury that burns rather than blazes. "He failed spectacularly." Daniel found his voice finally, but it came out defensive and hostile because those were the only emotions he could access through his shock. "You faked being paralyzed for 6 months. What kind of psychotic test?" Victoria finished for him, but she wasn't raising her voice because she didn't need to. The entire ballroom had gone silent, and every person present was leaning in to catch every word of this drama. The kind that reveals a man's true character when he thinks his wife is helpless, and the kind that documents how quickly he'll abandon his vows for his secretary who spits on disabled women. Amber's face went from pale to crimson in an instant, but Victoria had just revealed to everyone present that Amber Sutton, Daniel's new wife, was not only a homewrecker, but someone who assaulted the disabled. Several people in the crowd gasped audibly, but their eyes swung toward Amber with the kind of judgment that would follow her through every social and professional circle in Manhattan. "That's a lie!" Amber shrieked, but her voice pitched too high, betraying her panic even as she tried to deny the accusation. She turned to the crowd, her hands gesturing frantically, but she was hemorrhaging credibility with every desperate word. "She's making this up because she's bitter about the divorce." Victoria reached into her diamond clutch with deliberate slowness, but she withdrew a tablet that she'd had custom-made for this exact moment. She tapped the screen once, and the video began playing. Hospital room footage showing Amber spitting in Victoria's face, while Daniel stood by silently, but the audio was crystal clear and the HD quality left no room for interpretation. "I want to remember this moment," Amber's voice echoed from the tablet speakers, her recorded face twisted with cruelty that shocked the assembled guests. But Victoria let the video play for 30 more seconds before pausing it. "The moment I won." The silence that followed was so complete that Victoria could hear the champagne bubbles popping in glasses 20 feet away, but she wasn't done because this revelation was only the opening move in a chess game she'd spent 6 months planning. She handed the tablet to Jerome Whitmore, who'd pushed through the crowd with his wife Claire at his side, but his face had gone from jovial to thunderous as he watched the video replay. "There's more," Victoria said, her voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom because someone had killed the background music, but she was addressing Jerome specifically now. "Daniel and Amber began their affair approximately 14 months ago, but what's particularly interesting is how they used company resources to facilitate their relationship." She paused, letting the implications sink in. But several of the other partners were now pushing forward to hear what came next. Hotel rooms billed as client meetings, flights charged to the firm for conferences that never existed, thousands of dollars in expenses that funded their affair while Daniel was married to me. Daniel's face had progressed beyond pale into a grayish shade that suggested cardiac distress, but he grabbed Victoria's arm with enough force to leave marks. "You can't do this," he hissed, his voice shaking with fury and fear in equal measure, but his grip was the grip of a drowning man clutching at driftwood. "You're trying to ruin me, but I'll sue you for defamation, for fraud, for exposing the truth?" Victoria interrupted, but she looked pointedly at his hand on her arm until he released her, and then she rubbed the spot with exaggerated care. "You're welcome to try, Daniel, but I have 6 months of documentation that will stand up in any court." She turned back to Jerome and the assembled partners, but her next words would detonate like a nuclear weapon. "I should probably also mention that as of 9 a.m. this morning, I control 63% of Whitmore and Associates through Montgomery Holdings." The gasps this time were louder, but Jerome's face transformed from angry to calculating in an instant, because he was a businessman before he was anything else. "Montgomery Holdings," he repeated slowly, but his eyes were reassessing Victoria with new understanding. "As in Montgomery Pharmaceuticals, the Montgomery Empire?" "The very same," Victoria confirmed, but she was watching Daniel's face crumble as he finally understood the magnitude of what he'd thrown away. "I've spent the past 6 months quietly acquiring shares from partners who were looking to diversify, but I've left operational control entirely in your capable hands, Jerome." She smiled at him warmly, establishing an alliance in front of everyone present, but her next words had edges like broken glass. "However, I do think we need to have a serious conversation about the firm's expense policy and how we handle conflicts of interest." Daniel's knees actually buckled, but Amber caught him before he fell, and the two of them stood there clinging to each other like survivors of a shipwreck. The crowd around them had begun to murmur, but the tone was ugly. These were people who worshipped success and despised failure, but more importantly, they were people who recognized that Daniel and Amber had committed the cardinal sin of Manhattan society. They'd been caught. "You planned this," Daniel said, but his voice had gone hollow with defeat because he'd finally recognized that he wasn't watching a confrontation, he was witnessing an execution. From the beginning, the fall, the wheelchair, all of it was designed to trap me. "Not trap you," Victoria corrected, but her voice carried enough ice to frost the champagne glasses around them. "Test you, and you could have passed at any moment by simply being the man you promised to be when you said I do." She stepped closer to him, invading his personal space the way he'd once invaded hers with his betrayal, but her words were quiet enough that only he and Amber could hear. "Instead, you abandoned me at my most vulnerable, or what you believed was my most vulnerable, and you did it with such callous cruelty that you allowed your mistress to spit in my face." Amber made a sound like a wounded animal, but she was looking around wildly as if searching for an escape route from the social death she'd just experienced. Her Instagram-perfect face was contorted with panic, but Victoria had one more revelation that would complete Amber's destruction. "Oh, and Amber," Victoria said, raising her voice so the crowd could hear again, but she pulled out her phone and tapped through to a specific account. "You should know that the private Instagram account you created to mock me, the one called Crippled Wife Chronicles, where you posted photos of me in the wheelchair with cruel captions, that wasn't as private as you thought." She turned the phone so Amber could see the account displayed on the screen, but then she turned it outward so the crowd could glimpse the vicious posts. "My lawyers have already subpoenaed all of it for the civil suit. I'm filing against you for harassment and emotional distress." Amber's face went through several colors in rapid succession, but she finally settled on a shade of green that suggested imminent vomiting. "Those were jokes," she whispered, but even she didn't sound convinced by her own defense. private jokes between friends. Jokes that included photos of me that you took without my consent, captions that mocked my disability, and hashtags like "nah deadweight" and "trash takeout," Victoria said, but each word landed like a hammer blow. My lawyers estimate damages in the 7-figure range, but we'll let a jury decide exactly how funny they think you are. Jerome Whitmore stepped forward then, his role as senior partner demanding that he take control of the situation, but his eyes were cold as he addressed Daniel. "I think you should leave," he said, his voice carrying the finality of a judge's gavel. But everyone present understood that this was more than just an invitation to exit the party. "We'll be scheduling a meeting with the other partners to discuss your future at the firm, but I'd suggest you speak with an attorney before that conversation." Daniel looked around desperately, searching for allies among the crowd, but every face he encountered turned away with the kind of synchronized rejection that happens when social death is confirmed. He'd been a junior partner, never particularly well-liked, coasting on competence rather than brilliance, but now he was the man who'd abandoned his disabled wife for his secretary, the man who'd defrauded his firm, the man who'd catastrophically misjudged the woman he'd married. "You vindictive bitch," Amber hissed at Victoria, making one final attempt at offense because defense had clearly failed, but her voice cracked midway through the insult. "You'll pay for this, and I'll make sure everyone knows what a manipulative psycho you are." Victoria laughed then, but it was genuine amusement rather than performative cruelty, because Amber still didn't understand how thoroughly she'd been outmaneuvered. "Amber, darling," she said with mock sympathy that was more cutting than anger could ever be, "I have $8.7 billion, a team of lawyers who bill $1,100 an hour, and documented evidence of every cruel thing you've done." She paused, letting that sink in, but she wasn't finished. "You have a high school diploma, a secretary's salary that ended when you married Daniel, and a social media trail that makes you look like a cartoon villain, but please, do try to make me pay." Her smile widened into something predatory and final. "I look forward to adding you to my collection of cautionary tales." Security arrived then, summoned by Jerome with a subtle gesture, but the two men in dark suits approached Daniel and Amber with professional courtesy that barely masked their mandate. "Mr. Thorne, Mrs. Thorne, we need to ask you to leave the premises," the taller one said, but his hand hovered near Daniel's elbow in a way that suggested the request was actually a command. As they were escorted out, Daniel turned back once to look at Victoria, but his expression had cycled through every emotion possible and landed on something that looked like belated understanding. "I really didn't know," he said, the words carrying a weight that acknowledged he wasn't talking about her wealth, but about her strength, her intelligence, her fundamental nature that he'd never bothered to truly see. "No," Victoria agreed quietly, but her eyes held no forgiveness or reconciliation, only the cold satisfaction of a test administered and conclusively failed. "You didn't, and that's precisely why you deserved exactly what you got." The ballroom doors closed behind them with a muffled thud, but the sound echoed with finality through a space that had gone from social event to execution chamber and back again. The crowd remained frozen for approximately 5 seconds, but then the whispers began in earnest, a wave of speculation and judgment that would spread through Manhattan's social circles like wildfire. Victoria turned back to Jerome and Claire, but she was ready to move past the drama and into the business conversation that would define the future of Whitmore and Associates. "Now," she said pleasantly, as if she hadn't just destroyed 2 people's lives and careers in front of Manhattan's elite, "shall we discuss my vision for the firm's expansion into pharmaceutical legal services?" Jerome's laugh was surprised but genuine, but it carried the relief of a man who'd just realized that the new majority shareholder wasn't interested in tearing down his life's work. "Ms. Montgomery," he said, extending his hand in a gesture that acknowledged her as an equal rather than just a client or investor, "I think this is the beginning of a very interesting partnership." As Victoria shook his hand, she caught her reflection in one of the ballroom's ornate mirrors, but the woman looking back at her was someone transformed, not by the designer gown or the revenge or even the public revelation of her wealth, but by the simple act of standing up in every sense of the word. She'd spent 6 months in a wheelchair testing a man who'd failed, but the real test had been whether she had the strength to rise from that self-imposed prison and reclaim the power she'd temporarily surrendered. The gala continued around her, but Victoria moved through it with renewed purpose, making connections and establishing relationships that would serve her business empire for years to come. She danced with Jerome's son, a brilliant young attorney who blushed when she complimented his work on a recent pharmaceutical patent case, but she maintained perfect professional boundaries because she'd learned that lesson thoroughly. She spoke with Claire about philanthropic ventures that would benefit from Montgomery money and Whitmore expertise, but the conversation was between equals who recognized each other's worth. It was close to midnight when Victoria finally left the Carlisle, but Marcus was waiting with the car and a satisfied expression that suggested he'd enjoyed watching the security footage of the evening's main event. "Ms. Montgomery," he said as he opened her door, but his formality was undercut by the proud smile he couldn't quite suppress. That was masterfully done. "Thank you, Marcus," Victoria said as she settled into the leather seats, but she kicked off her designer heels with relief because even instruments of revenge could be uncomfortable. "Make sure legal files everything we discussed by end of business Monday and prepare a comprehensive report on both Daniel and Amber's current financial situation for the civil suit." "Already in progress," Marcus confirmed, but he glanced at her in the rearview mirror with something like concern. "If I may ask, do you feel better after all of that?" Victoria considered the question seriously as the car glided through Manhattan's nighttime streets, but the answer was more complicated than simple satisfaction. "I don't feel better," she admitted finally, her voice quiet with genuine reflection. "But I feel complete, and I feel like I honored the part of myself that refused to be a victim even when that would have been easier." She paused, watching the city lights blur past, but she was thinking about the woman she'd been 6 months ago, the woman who'd believed love meant accepting less than she deserved. "Daniel and Amber didn't destroy me, and more importantly, I proved to myself that I could be patient enough to let them destroy themselves." The car pulled up to her building, but Victoria sat for a moment longer, processing the evening and the 6 months that had led to it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the legal battles, the restructuring of Whitmore and Associates, the inevitable media attention when news of the Gala incident spread. But tonight she'd reclaimed something fundamental about herself. She'd stood up at the Gala and his world had collapsed. But the real victory wasn't in his destruction. It was in her liberation from ever caring about his world in the first place. 3 months after the Gala, Victoria stood in her corner office at Montgomery Holdings headquarters, but she was reviewing a financial report that brought genuine satisfaction rather than revenge. Whitmore and Associates had expanded into pharmaceutical litigation with spectacular success, but more importantly, the firm had implemented new ethics policies that would prevent future Daniel Thorns from abusing their positions. Daniel himself had been forced to resign from the partnership, but the firm's investigation into his expense fraud had resulted in civil penalties that would haunt him for years. His new position at a significantly less prestigious firm came with a fraction of his former salary, but Victoria had heard through various channels that he'd separated from Amber approximately 6 weeks after the Gala, when the reality of their reduced circumstances destroyed whatever illusion of love had sustained them. Amber faced her own reckoning, but the civil suit for harassment and emotional distress had been settled out of court for an undisclosed sum that Victoria immediately donated to charities supporting people with actual disabilities. The Instagram account had been deleted, but screenshots lived forever on the internet, ensuring that Amber's cruel jokes would follow her through any future job search or social climbing. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text from Claire Whitmore, but it was an invitation to lunch to discuss a new women's leadership initiative they were launching together. She smiled and accepted, because the best revenge wasn't just punishing those who'd wronged her. It was building something better from the ruins of what they'd tried to destroy. She walked to her office window, looking out over Manhattan with the perspective of someone who'd learned that being underestimated was sometimes the greatest advantage of all, but she no longer felt the need to hide her power or test anyone's loyalty through elaborate schemes. The wheelchair sat in the corner of her office, not as a prop, but as a reminder. Some prisons are of our own making, but the key to escape has always been in our pocket, and standing up is sometimes the bravest thing we can do. Victoria Montgomery had been abandoned, betrayed, and degraded, but she'd transformed those experiences into ammunition for a battle she'd won before her enemies even knew they were fighting. His world had collapsed when she stood up at the gala, but her world had expanded in ways that made his collapse seem like the minor footnote it truly was. She was a secret multi-billionaire who'd stopped faking weakness, and the view from standing up was better than anything she'd seen from a wheelchair, even one that had served its purpose perfectly.